Good morning, everyone. My name is Yun Sun, and I'm the co-director of the East Asia program here at Stimson. Thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion on Chinese FDI in Southeast Asia and its interaction with the local elite politics and civil society in the recipient countries. So as China enhances its foreign financing in infrastructure projects such a large financial input is expected to have, for example, interfere with the domestic politics or the domestic political dynamics in the recipient countries. And in the most recent Malaysian election, Chinese financing is argued to have favored the incumbent government. And in countries such as Cambodia and Laos, Chinese FDI plays a key, if not dominant role in their domestic economy, and then in turn its domestic politics. In Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, the Chinese money is having a direct and profound impact over its elite politics. Meanwhile, this impact is not one-way street. It's not just from China on Southeast Asia. When Chinese companies start their work in Southeast Asia, they are also subject to local political forces, such as a power contest among elites and the influence of the civil society in the countries. So what are the realities of Chinese FDI in Southeast Asia, and how do they shape the local politics and are also being shaped by the local politics? That is a question we're seeking to answer today. We have three experts joining us to explore the answer to this question. First, we have Kavi, who is currently the Asia Studies Fellow at the East-West Center, and he's also a senior fellow at Chulalongkorn University's Institute of Security and International Studies. So he has 4-decade-long journalism experience in Southeast Asia and is an avid observer of China's role in the region. Secondly, we have Alvin Kamba, who is a doctoral candidate in sociology at Johns Hopkins University and a non-resident fellow at the Strat-based ADR Institute. His research uses mixed method approach to derive the determinants of Chinese foreign direct investment, the dynamics of elite competition, and the political economic effects of capital mobility on the developing world. Last but not least, we have our own Courtney, who is a research analyst with the Southeast Asia program at Stimson. Her focus is on infrastructure development, Mekong River, climate change, energy issues, and Chinese investment in the Southeast Asia energy infrastructure. So we will go in the order of our seating sequence, basically. And each expert will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A. Thank you. Well, Kavi, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I feel really at home with politics in Washington like this. I'm feeling at home. I'm stressing at home because given the election in Malaysia, it demonstrated that if you live long enough, you will become prime minister again and again. And I think that will happen in Thailand and in Cambodia.
But
having said that.
Not here, right?
Well, I don't know yet. 72 years is still young. Having said that, I can go because Yun Sun has given me assignments. I will spoke on 3 points. Why Southeast Asia loves China, invite China, and then why China loves Southeast Asia. And then my third point, when you love each other, you have problems. Come in between. Okay. You have fixer, local fixer. We have tons of Michael Cohen in Thailand, in Cambodia. Actually, we are much better because they are not lawyers in Thailand. They are politicians. They are much better. Here is a little bit too high fly. So 3 big reasons why ASEAN needs China. I think you have to view China in a broader context. A lot of time people here look at China bilaterally, but China is a very big country. So number one, I think China wants to make sure that Southeast region in the Thai jargon is under its armpit. You know, under your armpit means under your influence. So that's what China needs because China wants Southeast Asia to be stable, conducive for the economic development internally, especially in southern part. So with the region, expect to grow 5% annually. So it's good to have Southeast Asia now. That's number one. Why we need China to do so? Because Southeast Asia need financial support. But you need financial support, not in traditional way. World Bank way, ADB way is a little bit too long, too sluggish, you know. We need a much speedier, the so-called, I hate to say this, Chinese way. Chinese way you have, what is Chinese way? We have to explain later. I'm come from Thailand. Thailand is part of ASEAN. We talk about ASEAN way. So ASEAN way is a lot of talk, you know, no action. But Chinese way is a lot of action, less talk. You know, 随随便便, the Chinese will say very casual. I will explain later. I'm a journalist first, okay? So my generalization might cause some problem, but I want to give you the broader picture. So Southeast Asia need China financial support quickly and in all dimensional. So I think China is a very good funder. Number 3, as you can see, whether it's Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, these leaders need to leave a legacy that they have built up economic growth, built up economic prosperity before they leave the stage. Najib failed. Najib failed. In fact, Najib was the one who promoted China investments in the most incredible way. 3 reasons why China needs ASEAN. Okay, I will go briefly to this. First, if you see all this Belt and Road Initiative, I don't want to go into detail. People will give you all kinds of information from the Chinese, from the governments, you know, affect how many countries. But for me, from Southeast Asia point of view, a lot of decision is made based on geopolitics. It's not on economic consideration. That is why it's sometimes very fast. And this is very important, as I said earlier, that China wants to make sure that Southeast Asia, in America, they said Southeast Asia is China's backyard. For me, Southeast Asia is China's front yard. If front yard is ruined, it's finished. Xi Jinping's new era foreign policy is finito, so cannot. So I think China front yard is Southeast Asia. If you want to survive in the next century, which I think will be Asian century, American first will usher. After a few days ago, I come to think, coming to America, I'm really excited because I felt that American first will usher Asian first as well, because it's this drive to breach the so-called East Asian exceptionalism. I hate to quote Xi Jinping, the so-called Asian way. You have ASEAN way already, Asia by Asia. This kind of thing will come into discussion in the future. Maybe I'm jumping ahead. So that explains why China, with this kind of geopolitical consideration, give out this mega project. Sometimes you think that it doesn't make sense. But for China, it makes sense. A lot of good projects now under review. And I think Malaysia, maybe there are totally, I think, about 33 projects under BRIs. And some of them will be source of review, readjust. But I don't think it will be like mid-zone dam as in Myanmar. That's very extreme. I will explain because I think Southeast Asian behavior toward China has a different level. Second, China needs Southeast Asia to throw money away, to invest the excess capitals and productivity, particularly, I think, in transportation, high-speed train, because China already complete everything, you know, for the past 14, 15 years have laid down complete land, high-speed train transportations and all that. Now, it's good to have this thing export, at least to keep up the economy. In fact, if you want my real assessment, China is really mad at Thailand because Thailand delayed the negotiation on high-speed train for 3.5 years. That's a lot of money for delay, the so-called the fees and many other things. Number 3, as I argue that Xi Jinping Belt and Road will be successful or not depends on how the overall relation with ASEAN, Southeast Asia. When you refer to Southeast Asia, of course, the 10 different countries, each country has a different behavior. Earlier, I discussed with my friends here, Sanyun, that if you look carefully, 10 different countries have different attitude towards the Chinese, and reflects their indigenous capacity to deal with China. On the low end, you have Laos, Cambodia, and if East Timor join ASEAN next year, you have 3 countries that has the lowest capacity to bargain with the Chinese. And then you have the country at the top levels, you have Vietnam and Myanmar, who have very strong, abrasive, aggressive attitude, bargaining chip against China because of their historical, because of their borders, and many other factors. And then you have other countries in the middle. I would separate Indonesia from the middle, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore are the countries that has all well-rounded bargaining power with China. So all around, socially, politically, culturally, and whatever. So they can argue with the Chinese. So you have this kind of different level that reflects on whatever terms that came out. So I think our friends out in here will discuss in detail the so-called elite coercions and networking. As I said earlier, in Thailand, dealing with the Chinese is a very sweepy and very casual, because and China, what is great about China investment is that it's all very, very flexible. Particularly in the case of, I can only say the case in Thailand, because if you're tough, China will respond. So China is very practical. For example, in negotiation with the Chinese over the high-speed train, we toughen our condition, China respond. At first it's like negotiating with Laos, all the basic conditions, and then the Thai said, no, we want this, and then China said, okay, let's move on, and then another delay, okay, we move on, and then another delay. So it depends totally on the recipient attitude, the way you deal with the Chinese. Now back to my last part, okay, I don't want to eating into other people's time. So what is the challenge? When China invests such a huge, whether it's BRI, under bilateral, or what under disguise, there are always a problem. The first problem has to do with trust. Do you trust the Chinese? China said you should trust us because we are middle kingdom, you know, we are for Asia, you must trust us. We speak, you know, in China, in Thailand, you send money without going to the bank. I said, can you send $10,000 to my family in somewhere else, you know, we have the local illegal money, you know, just sign 10,000, that's it. I'm not suggesting that you do that or make a project, but just to give you some sense that you either trust him or you don't. If you trust, then there's certain things you have to follow. If you don't trust, then you have rule of law. I really don't like, you know, in America when they talk about rule of law. Thailand also have rule of law. Southeast Asia have rule of law. But the way we conduct rule of law implemented is a little bit slow. And sometimes not comprehensively. But to say that we don't have rule of law is incorrect. So the fact that you always insist rule of law, we do have. Otherwise, how can we survive? And ASEAN actually is the country with rule of law. That is why you go too slow. Consensus is rule of law. So let us be realistic. So trust, Chinese way, or the so-called, you can argue they have international norm, and I think China now try to prove itself that it's moved up the stage. AIIB is still work in progress. The jury is still out. And I must say, it's a long, long, long plateau, high curve, you know, that China has to prove. Secondly, it's also, if you deal with Chinese project, and I think my friends Alvin will say, not very clear and very ambiguous. It's very normal that you have to be able to understand the Chinese thinking, the Chinese way, not the Chinese thinking Western way or the Thai way or the Filipino way. You will make mistake. you must understand what China, when they offer you in Chinese way, otherwise you lost out in translation. And please, with Southeast Asia, we lost out in translation all the time. And I think when recently, I just give you one clear example, lost in translation. Recently, China came out with a statement saying that we would like to see China cooperation with Lanchang, Mekong Corporation in the bulldozer way. Bulldozer, in Chinese, they use the word 提土机. Bulldozer in Chinese means we make things smooth, no problem, seamless. But in Western sense, my God, you use bulldozer, you mean you intimidate our smaller country. That kind of thing. But the Chinese think in Chinese and then translate into English. Not like the Thai. You want to convince the Westerner, you write in English and then translate into Thai. So, but in Chinese, you write in Chinese. You write in Japanese. Japanese and Korean also, these three countries, lost in translation. So a lot of initiative doesn't ring the bell. That's why you have Belt and Road. This is like the 9th version. I remember I stayed in China 3 years ago at China Delhi. We have to struggle whether it's a Silk Road, whether it's economic. There's so many things. And then one belt, one road. And then BRI, in Thailand, one belt, mine is 38. What is yours? So that's the problem. So no, don't listen to that. You just have to understand what China wants to say one belt, fine. Go ahead, one belt. One road, too many road, fine. That's fine. So go ahead, understand what China wants to say and use them. China said win-win, Thai said, oh, you win, we lose, win-win. Use China jargon, just like the American use ASEAN jargon during the Obama administration. Use their jargon, use their understanding. Equitable, consultative, win-win, now 3 win. So if it's 2 win, no, okay? That's my second point. Third one, be careful, mainly, as Alvin said, that it's bilaterally.
Yeah.
But I think now China will go also, because a lot of time, bilaterally is not good. China needs the institutional, broader framework to help. AIB is there. China has set up 3 institutions, financials to back up. You have Silk Road Fund, you have Lanchang, Mekong Fund, over $300 million, many other things that come in. But this is still new, and I don't think anybody have any assessment. Most of the assessment are pretty negative when it comes to China investment. But wait, I think China will be more pragmatic and improve itself. Otherwise, projects that deal with Southeast Asia, I cannot say other projects in Sri Lanka or Pakistan or out there in Africa, but in Southeast Asia, China has to be extremely careful. If you make mistake, you don't correct it, it will have far-reaching consequences. Because you affect one ASEAN country, affect Thailand, it will have a contagious effect toward other ASEAN countries. Just look at South China Sea, even though we have that operation during 2012. Now, again, the fourth one is mainly top-down. If you know a good person at the top level, you have to deal. And I think that's why the elites are so important. We have Michael Cohen in Thailand, but most of them do not wear business suit. In military, they wear boots. And they are son siblings of famous tycoon and all that. So it's different. You need local fixer. And in Thailand now, we have certain personality that have good relation with Chinese leaders. So they mushrooming into other areas, security, and then into commercial areas become much more encompassing. So it's that kinds of relation. Finally, you also have the so-called local Chinese and overseas Chinese, the so-called local Chinese connection. It depends on which country. I think in Malaysia, in Singapore, because of the preponderance cultural influence, the Chinese majorities, the Chinese community is important. In Thailand, of course, you talk about economic, political area, both Thai Chinese. Normally, you don't go and say that in Thailand, like me. My father is migrated from China when he was a young boy. I wanted to study English in Penang, but he gets stuck in Thailand, and I blame him for that. And it's a generation, you don't call me I'm Thai Chinese. I'm Thai as a Thai can be. Look at Thai Prime Minister. You know, it's all like that, you know. So, no, a lot of Thai don't speak Chinese, not like Malaysia, not like Singapore. They are Huaren, they are, you know. We are not. We are Thai Huaren, and Thai as Thai can be. So, whenever people say, "Yo, are you Thai Chinese? Are you American Chinese the way you talk like American?" No, we are Thai as Thai can be. You know, you look at my name, well, anyway. But that's the point. That's the point. So, influentially, to certain point. But that's it. You know, local politics, important. I will discuss later. I leave it to Alvin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very colorful description, but I do have questions, which I will push you on later. And Alvin, please enlighten us on the relationship between Chinese FDI and the elite politics.
Yeah, right. First, thank you for being here and for listening to this presentation. Just like Avi, my mom's family also comes from migrants from Fujian. And then I grew up as a Filipino. I mean, I'm Filipino through and through, and that, but at the same time, I do have this influence that goes back to family and generations before. My presentation is based on my fieldwork, which is a thorough analysis of elite politics in the Philippines, which I did for 2 years. Mainly interviews with high-level politicians, from senators to congressmen to even Chinese investors. I started doing my fieldwork for Indonesia and Malaysia, but these are tentative for now, and I'm still working on those. So the title of this presentation is Elite Cohesion and Conflict: Chinese FDI in Maritime Southeast Asia. Now, the first thing is to differentiate. This is I'll do this quickly, but the main difference of foreign direct investment from, let's say, Chinese loans is that foreign direct investment asserts asset ownership, meaning China has to own the particular asset, whether it's greenfield investment or a particular percentage of a share in the global south or in the developing country. This is what distinguishes FDI. Loans come in, as you know, with the Belt and Road Initiative and sort of other Chinese projects before, when loans are pay for contracted service by Chinese companies. Now, this is clear at some point, but it becomes tricky when for some projects, equity in the asset can be used to pay for Chinese aid or loans. The particular case would be the Sri Lankan port, as people know. The interesting case is that some projects actually are sort of under discussion, that they can be Chinese-owned after project completion. But some of these projects were actually canceled and rejected, such as the North Rail case in the Philippines, which is a popular case for a contracted service. But there was also discussion between Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo's officials and Sinomac at that time to possibly have a Chinese ownership after the construction. And this actually got to the local elites and the opposition in the Philippines, which actually bolstered their forces to oppose Chinese rail at that time. Now, these things are unreported, and these are things that we need fieldwork to get into. Now, I'll just go briefly, but these are two data sets that are famous that are used in Chinese aid and loans. The MOFCOM, as you know, from which looks at FDI stock data, and the AEI data by the Heritage Foundation, which is a couple of blocks from here, which mainly analyzes. They have interns looking at internet data and putting it down. The good thing, what's interesting here is that you can separate the two between what is a pledge and actualization. People have argued that MOFCOM is more of FDI that's actualized, that's been dispersed, while AEI is more of the pledges or the commitments of Chinese companies. Now, this is just brief data on MOFCOM and FDI data in the Philippines. In the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where Indonesia would be the highest at 8 billion, Malaysia would be at 2 billion, and the Philippines is at 711 million. This is in 2015. This is the latest MOFCOM data. I'm reluctant to use AEI because AEI has a floor effect. It excludes FDI below 100 million, so it's problematic to it's limited, but it's useful at some point. Now, what's my argument? The argument of this paper is that it's very simple and straightforward. Elite cohesion leads to high levels of large Chinese FDI. So these are the biggest, most important Chinese foreign direct investments, whether mostly in strategic sectors. There are, of course, smaller Chinese FDIs in manufacturing, services, mostly goes to export processing zones. A lot of these are smaller at a few hundred millions to a few hundred thousands to low millions. And a lot of this foreign direct investment are not directly affected, in my view, of like elite politics. But of course, extreme levels of elite conflict can affect this like smaller and foreign direct investment. But for this paper, I'm focusing on like large foreign direct, large Chinese FDI. Now, conflict matters. Conflict matters mostly to large Chinese FDI, and conflict affects projects during or even after project completion or administrative change. So the example of North Rail in the Philippines, this was a project that was affected but when it was being constructed. There's another case of the ICBC in the Philippines. This is not reported as well. This is something I got through fieldwork. The Industrial Commercial Bank of China, they tried to invest in the Philippines and they almost agreed, but there was an issue of the middleman blocking the deal, and this actually eventually led to the deal's cancellation. Now, there are, of course, projects that get affected even after the project becomes completed. The SGCC in the Philippines, the State Grid Corporation of China in the Philippines, was completed during Arroyo, and then Aquino, because of the South China Sea issue, placed some pressure on the SGCC to kick out the engineers in 2014 when the South China Sea issue was like rising. Now, why are elites in conflict, and what are they fighting? Why are they like, what's the issue? What is at stake? Now, political elites, in my view, they're interested in power, and FDI deals, particularly from Chinese deals, and if they're perceived to be corrupt, become easy targets for them to bring down the rival. Economic elites also matter. I mean, this would be the local oligarchs or the oligarchs in a particular host state or capitalist groups, and they're interested in keeping investors out so they can like use the economic sectors themselves to earn money. And also geopolitics also matters. This would be some political elites, and I would argue some military leaders who are concerned about the South China Sea. Now, any of these issues may occur in a particular Southeast Asian, in these three states I'm looking at, which is like Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and of course in other countries as well, but in this paper, just the three states. Now, but the importance of these three issues vary across time and across places. Now, we can all agree that elite politics matter, but the crux of the argument is like, how does elite politics matter? And this would be this would be the crux of my argument. Comparing Chinese FDI across countries is very difficult, mainly because countries vary in terms of economic size. Countries vary across like GDP. The economy of Indonesia is 3 times the size of the Philippines, and 8 billion in Indonesia would be totally different in, let's say, 8 billion in the Philippines, because the size of the Indonesian economy is much bigger than the Philippines. The same thing with the Malaysian economy versus the Philippines. So comparing FDI in absolute numbers is very difficult. What's interesting here is that we can look at the impact of elite politics on cancelled projects, meaning projects that would have occurred had elite politics not emerged in such extreme high levels during particular periods. And I'm arguing that this is where we can actually see elite politics, because the rise of Chinese FDI in many Southeast Asian states, as what Kavi said, and a lot of people have argued, it's not a puzzle. Chinese FDI is growing across the world. There's growing importance. From a few hundred millions in the 1990s to like 2.5 trillion if you like include Hong Kong and China together in like post 2010. And Southeast Asian countries are also increasing. So the rise of Chinese FDI, particularly this like the blue and all these other things, it's not puzzling. What's puzzling would be the counterfactuals. Would they have been higher had elite politics been different, right? Would other projects have come in? If particular projects actually came in, let's say these projects are worth billions, these figures could have been higher, because these figures don't capture cancelled projects. These figures don't capture projects that were opposed by elites, in my view. And this is for me how I go into particular cases. Now, I'm going to spend more time talking about the Philippines because I know it the best, but I'm going to talk about Indonesia and Malaysia as well. Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, as you know, was a very, she was a very contentious president. Interesting fact, my mom actually was sort of part of her cabinet. And this is actually how I got into, not center, but she was in the networks. So this is how I got into interviews with like people, and it was really like interesting to see how elite politics actually came into play. Now, ZTE and Sinoma, the North Rail projects, there were discussions actually between the Chinese investors and the Philippine officials to make them to possibly have equity ownership after the completion of the deals. This never happened because obviously these deals were like canceled and these deals were opposed by the elites. But at the same time, these issues actually got around the opposition, like the Philippine opposition, and then this bolstered them to, we don't want we don't want any like Chinese ownership. At the same time, they want to bring down Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. The interesting case would be ICBC, where it was a project negotiated for. This is not in the news in any way. This project was negotiated for $4 billion. And Arroyo wanted this project to actually come in the Philippines so you can create like small banks so they can disperse like money in the Philippine provinces. But the middleman at that time, that I will not name for the sake of my safety, because this person is, well, not this person, someone related to this person is part of in the circle of the 30 right now. Oh my God, we're being live streamed. Okay. So the middleman did not said to the ICBC, give me like equity in some of the branches, or else I'm not gonna push this project forward. And then ICBC said, no, we're not gonna give you this. We're a clean company. We're not gonna do this. Now, hypothetically, Arroyo could have punished this middleman and replaced this with somebody else, but she wasn't powerful enough. In 2007, Arroyo was, there were numerous impeachment charges. There were numerous like accusations against Arroyo. She needed this middleman to maintain power because this middleman was actually center to keeping Congress in line so that she wouldn't be impeached during that time. Now, there were similar projects as well. There's 18 agricultural projects and 2 big mining projects that were pushed by local elites, but we can talk about that later. Elite conflict also happened during Aquino. In fact, there were issues. Aquino, before the South China Sea issue emerged, Aquino promised to bring $13 billion, and some of these projects were in the works. They were talked about, and there were some feasibility projects done on them. But South China Sea emerged particularly. One reading that hasn't really been written on is like, in my view, there was a faction in the Aquino administration that was really wanted to protect South China. They wanted to claim South China Sea, and this led to the more. Aquino was vacillating. Am I going to protect the South China Sea, or am I going to like get investments? At the end of the day, the other faction won. So at the end of the day, none of these investments actually pushed forward because the South China Sea issue emerged. Now, what's interesting here is that these figures, the Philippines would be the gray one, the ones in the lowest. These figures, I would argue, could have been higher had the projects moved forward, had the elites not oppose, or had the elites failed to oppose these projects. So again, it goes back to my argument that we can't really detect elite competition if we look at absolute figures, because figures are, different economies. Some economies are bigger than others, but we can detect them by looking at the counterfactuals. That's the argument here. I would argue that these projects the Philippine figure could have been higher, if elites at that time were. I would argue if there was cohesion, and at that time if there was a stronger push for Chinese FDI. Now towards my favorite president. I meant that as a sarcasm. Okay, don't take me for.
Thank you.
Now, in my view right now, there's cohesion. He's very charismatic to us. People have written about populism. He's very charismatic. All the elites are like around him, and all the elites are following him. This is what's happening right now. So there's Chinese FDI actually. This is AEI data. So these are pledges. But I have BSP data as well. Central Bank of the Philippines, where FDI from China and Hong Kong actually went up. It's already 2/3 from what it was during Aquino administration. So this, and this is only the second year of Duterte. So I guess my argument here, however, is that in 2019, the Philippine mid-elections is going to come up, and this is where we can detect elite like conflict. I would argue all these administrations in these different countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, all have elite cohesion at the start of the term, and conflict emerges near the end of the term. Now the question is like, how will the regime manage conflict? That's for me like what gets Chinese investments in. So if the 2019 elections comes up and Duterte is less powerful, I would argue that Chinese foreign direct investment will be targeted by Filipino elites and by local oligarchs, and it will be brought down. However, for me, if there's cohesion, then it won't happen. Of course, that's a $1 million prediction. I hope I'm correct, and this will not come back to bite me if I'm applying for an academic job. Now, Malaysia. I will argue that Abdullah Badawi's term was actually relatively. I'll go through the last cases fast. So I'm running out of time, but this was a relatively like cohesive administration. Of course, there was conflict in at the end of this term, and the vote of no confidence at the 2008 2009 actually emerged. But at this time, there was a steady growth of Chinese FDI, as you can see from that chart. This is MOFCOM data. There were no major projects that, from my research at least, that were canceled and that were opposed at that time. A lot of the projects were coming in. They were going to construction, and they were going to manufacturing, the small manufacturing at that time. There was steady growth, although the numbers are not impressive. It's only, I think this is millions of dollars, so it's only until like 500 million by 2009. Now, the more interesting thing would be Najib tried, as a very as everybody would know, Belt and Road Initiative tries to bring. He shifted Chinese FDI from looking at infrastructure, from looking at manufacturing and small construction to infrastructure projects, and there are big projects that have been happening. And the most interesting thing is that Thailand's national car manufacturing, Proton, 49% was sold to I think it's called Gleki. It's a Chinese company. 49% right now is owned by a Chinese company, which is like the national. It's a pride of Malaysia. Now, what's interesting here for me is that Chinese investment was used as a reason to bring down to the recent Malaysian elections where Mahathir won. Mahathir has spoken repeatedly in media against Chinese investments. He actually spoke against the Proton issue. He spoke against the rail issue. And what's interesting here would be now that these guys are in power, this would be AEI data. So these are commitments. Would these commitments actually be a lot smaller in the coming years? Now that you have an administration that is much less optimistic about Chinese investments. So again, it's hard to detect them by figures. We have to look at counterfactuals. Now, the last case would be Indonesia, and I'm going to wrap it up soon. Again, so during Yudhoyono, start of his term, there was cohesion, and then conflict emerged. At this time, I would argue that during his first term, there was the administration there was cohesion, and this brought Chinese investments to come in mining particularly, and other palm oil and energy. Now, what's interesting is that Widodo comes. There's conflict at the end of Yudhoyono, and Widodo comes in. Elite cohesion occurred, and then right now, what's happening is that a lot of Chinese investments are coming in terms of infrastructure, mining, and a lot of these other big projects that Widodo actually wants right now. Now, what's interesting here is that these are two different data sets, one AEI and one MOFCOM, and they actually agree on something. So this actually is an indicator that between 2014 and 2015, there was a huge push of Chinese FDI, both in actualized and in pledge. So because they're consistent. Now, in 2016, 2017, this would be, because the MOFCOM data only goes until 2015, so in the AEI, you can see that it actually went down. Now, I can't really explain this right now. Why is this happening? One can argue because projects take some time to be negotiated and for it to come in. Now because I'm not, I don't know, policy recommendations. As an academic, this is my first time to do this. But what's interesting here for me is that all these investments are targeted by elites, particularly when they actually have distributive effects on the population and distributive effects that actually harm other elites. So for investments to be protected, I would argue that it's necessary for investors to go for projects that are growth enhancing, projects that distribute economic benefits. Number two, elite coalitions and elites matter. And this is something that is currently neglected in the literature on Chinese FDI and the literature of foreign direct investment, which I'm trying to bring back in my dissertation. Lastly, I would argue geopolitics also comes in elite coalitions and elite and coalitions. Now, I don't really work on geopolitics so much, but this is an external, in academic terms, this is an external variable that comes in that can affect the equation. And this is something that Kavi talks about much more rather than myself. Now, again, to summarize, this is the end of the presentation. Cohesion leads to high levels of Chinese FDI. Conflict leads to low levels. All administrations have cohesion at the start and conflict after. But what's crucial is to examine, I would argue, how the administrations manage elite conflict and what is the trend within the administration. Apart from that, I apologize for going over time by 2 minutes. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you, Evan. That's a fascinating discussion. We have so many questions, so we will grill you later. And before that, we will have Courtney to talk about the civil society in Southeast Asia and how the local societal politics affects the Chinese FDI, or how the Chinese FDI either escalate or intensifies the civil society's either their rejection or their observation and monitoring of the Chinese projects. Courtney, please.
So thank you for that, Ian. So as Ian said, I will talk a little bit about Chinese FDI, particularly in mainland Southeast Asia, looking through the lens of environmental, social impacts, civil society, and the conflict that that can bring to Chinese investment projects. So there are really three trends here that I think are important to consider when looking at Chinese FDI in the region and the results of Chinese FDI. The first is the sectors that China invests in. So when you look at civil society reactions to investment projects throughout Southeast Asia, by and far the greatest civil society reactions, protests, perception changes are surrounding the projects that are in infrastructure, power, mining, essentially the things that will have deep impacts on the local livelihoods for people in the region. And so when you're looking at conflicts in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and potentially even Vietnam, the greatest reactions often come to Chinese mines, Chinese hydropower projects, sometimes pipelines, sometimes roads and railways. Essentially, the type of investment here matters because China is by far the largest investor in these types of projects in the last few years compared to other investors. Looking just at the investments in Myanmar, China has something like 44 hydropower projects, 6 to 7 mines, numerous railroads. There was the pipeline project that's been in place, but as Alvin commented on, I believe, often conflict doesn't only happen as the project is being built, but in the years following the project. So China just has an outsized role in these sectors, and it comes under a great deal of criticism for that reason compared to other investors. And it's important to note other investors also face challenges in these regions. But because of sort of the speed of Chinese investments and the extreme amounts that have flowed into these countries in recent years, China has come under greater criticism. The second key factor is the standards that companies follow when investing in these types of projects. So generally speaking, if you're looking at countries in Southeast Asia, there will be great variance in the legal standards that each country adopts based on their level of development. China has a great deal of investment within mainland Southeast Asia in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, which, looking at ASEAN, are some of the countries that have either the lowest legal standards for environmental and social impact assessments, for pollution requirements, for reporting requirements, but just as importantly, even in countries that have these laws on the books, the capacity to monitor and to review the environmental and social impact assessments is relatively low. And more importantly, enforcement is quite low and a huge challenge. So when you look at for instance, in Cambodia, the Ministry of Environment is the organization that is tasked with laying out the standards, with reviewing environmental and impact assessments for large infrastructure projects and others, for identifying areas where the initial environmental social impact assessments need to be done to a further degree, and essentially asking for a full EIA. And then in monitoring and enforcing things. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Environment is also at least historically, one of the politically least powerful organizations in the country. And so officials within the Ministry of Environment actually noted that from 1996, when the first laws were put on the books, to 2011, only 110 projects actually received environmental and social impact assessments out of thousands of projects that came into the country. So the local legal framework is important here because of the way that outside companies follow that. Chinese companies, when they come in and invest in these countries, and this is speaking broadly, and I'll try to speak to a couple specific anecdotal case studies, but Chinese companies, by and large, tend to apply to whatever the local standards are. So they come in, they follow the local laws, that's the defense that is taken when there's criticism. Western companies, by and large, and again, there are exceptions on both sides here, but Western companies, by and large, have internal standards that they hold to. They're a little bit more accountable. They're often more transparent about the process that they're taking in performing these standards. They hold to international best practices as laid out in documents ranging from the Equator Principles to guidelines from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other international financial institutions. Chinese companies do not often do this, and in cases where there is criticism coming in, ranging from projects like the Myitsone Dam to lower Saison 2, you see a variety of responses to this. There's a widespread perception among many that when you look at Chinese developments, companies take a pollute first, clean up later mindset. Commenters have often said that they get the sense that Chinese investors feel that there is going to be an impact from infrastructure projects and that it's important to consider that in the cleanup of pollution and other issues down the road when countries are in a better developmental position, where they've had economic development, and where they can afford to look at these issues, essentially. Now, whether or not that's a reality, to some extent, when you're looking at the impact of civil society and the local perceptions among people, perception sometimes matters more than reality. In some cases, Chinese companies have held to higher standards. But if they are perceived as not doing so, or if there's just strong feeling they haven't done enough engagement with local populations about these standards, they don't have a good enough explanation of what they have done, or even if they are going above the local standards, if it's still not meeting the concerns of local populations, then it is often attributed to the fact that they are a Chinese company. So a few specific instances from Chinese projects here, looking at the contracting practices. So Western companies often for doing environmental, social impact assessments, monitoring, mitigation, they often hire outside third-party independent contractors to perform these assessments, to review these assessments, to assist with monitoring. This is historically not widely been the case with Chinese companies, or if they do hire another contractor, as in the case of the Myitsone Dam, it's not a contractor that is recognized as having international best practices or applying international best practices in the way that they do environmental impact assessments. This has been seen in China with the Stongche Areng Dam, which, as some of you may have heard of, it was a proposed project in Cambodia. In recent years, it's located in the Kokong region, which abuts a protected national forest area. It's a high area for biodiversity. It has minority ethnic groups living there. And a Chinese hydropower company came in and was going to build a relatively small dam. I think it was something like 150 megawatts. So when you're looking at the size of a project, not huge compared to many of the dams that China has built domestically on the upstream or elsewhere around the world. But the impacts are potentially considerable. And the Chinese contractor for these projects did the initial environmental and social impact assessment for the project, submitted it to the Cambodian government. It was in line with the local standards, but the Cambodian government should have flagged a number of issues in the original environmental and social impact assessment for further review, and they did not. And so as a result, there were numerous outside studies done, often led by civil society groups that had expertise in local environmental situation, local livelihoods, local development projects, resource management, that led various other studies highlighting essentially problems with the environmental and social impact assessment. And this was very influential in local protests and that ultimately led to the suspension of the project. A third key factor that it is important to consider when looking at the behavior of Chinese companies, especially these large infrastructure projects in the region, is the extent to which developers interact with non-government stakeholders. So another widespread perception of the way that Chinese companies behave is that they come in, and as Alvin was commenting, and they have their local fixer, who is often someone within government or the local elites, the business community, people who have a feeling and a sense of how things work on the ground. And the Chinese companies tend to interact directly with the government and their local fixers, and not interact directly with the great variety of other stakeholders that have strong feelings about these projects in which they are investing. And as a result, they tend to respect what is told to them by the government and dismiss commentary that is coming from the public media, from civil society organizations. Now, the Myitsone suspension is in many ways a perfect case study of how this played out. Now, Myitsone is, of course, a very complex project because it also was located in a conflict zone. There was Kachin-Tatmadaw military conflict. It was at a time of political transition in Myanmar. So there are a lot of other important factors that led to the suspension of the Myitsone project as well. But when you look at the way that Myitsone investment company, the China Power Investment Corporation, which has since changed names because it's been bought out, but I will just refer to it as CPI for simplicity's sake. When CPI came in, They worked directly with the governments. They notably, and have said this many times, went above and beyond the local standards because at the time they were investing, there were absolutely no local requirements for them to do any sort of environmental and social impact assessment. So the fact that they did one was important, should be viewed as a sign that they have successfully come in and are going above and beyond. This is something that they have said many times. Their spokespeople have emphasized that, they were not just doing the minimum, they did something, and they feel that that's an important distinction to make. However, when you look into the amount of engagements that they had with the local population, it's very notable that their meetings were arranged in coordination with the assistance of the local governments, and they met with 6 village heads. They did not meet with the various civil society organizations working in the region. They did not meet or do a widespread survey of the population. They met with the village heads, and essentially we've been told in discussions with them that up until the suspension of the project, the village heads had continuously given them assurance that the local population supported this project, and so they took that as fact. So looking more broadly, this is something particularly in the hydropower sector, which has been a huge challenge. And that's mainly because for hydropower, there's often a significant amount of relocation that has to happen. Environmental issues gather a great deal of attention from the international community. They gather a great deal of attention from many civil society organizations. But when you talk to the local population, one of the biggest areas where there's disagreement for these investment projects is almost always comes down to be relocation packages and compensation. And across the board, many Chinese companies essentially defer the standards for compensation and the management of the relocation process to the local government. This is something that's been seen in Myanmar. It's been something that's been seen for numerous hydropower projects in Laos on the Nam U Cascade, for instance. There's been a lot of debate about how this process was handled for the suspended Stongche Arang project in Cambodia. Now, this is obviously a very complex process, but the fact that the Chinese investors essentially took this as a hands-off procedure. Oh, well, we recognize there may be problems with this, but we're not handling this. This is being handled by the local government. Whether or not that's in line with local standards when it comes to the perception of the locals in civil society, that perception, again, is the challenge here. It's perceived that the Chinese company is engaging in a way that is negatively impacting local interests and not respecting the needs of locals. So that's just sort of a brief overview. I don't want to take too much time and go over time. I know there's a lot of interest and discussion here, but I do think it's also important to note within this context that was a lot of criticism of China. It is important to note that there has been a slight shift, and it is a process, but many Chinese companies have recognized that this is a problem, particularly the large state-owned enterprises that have been burned by Myanmar and other projects abroad. And so companies which previously came under a lot of criticism may still come under criticism, but they are making efforts internally to try and address some of these issues. And a potential example of this is the Lower Sesan 2 project in Cambodia. Across the board, environmentalists look at this project and highlight this as a severe challenge for fisheries production in the region. It's estimated that fish stocks in the Mekong region may drop about 9% from this single dam, which has been built by Hydrolansang. However, it was originally going to be built by a Vietnamese company, which ended up pulling out over the controversy. And it appears that the Lower Sesan 2 project is most likely one of the political projects that was mentioned before. It's not being done because the Chinese investor is looking at this as an opportunity to make money, although they will make money off of the project. But there's a political aspect to this, in that it was a request from the Cambodian government that China come and assist with this project because they needed the electricity that would be coming from it. And so Hydrolansang came into this project, did the design for the project, and going back to the fisheries issue, they wanted to make sure that there was some fisheries mitigation built in. Now, the approach that they took to this was to look at key biodiversity species, identifying a handful of key species and trying to design a fish law that would essentially protect those key species. So when you talk to Hydrolansang, they say, we think that it's important to look at biodiversity. We went out of our way above and beyond some of the local laws to ensure that we're building fish mitigation in here. And actually we got burned for it because when we presented the final design to the government in Cambodia, they said that the price of electricity, if we include these additional mitigation services and designs, would be too high, so we can't include them, and we ended up paying for it out of our own pocket because internally we are required to meet these standards. So regardless of the eventual outcome of lower Seisantu, which again many outside critics and environmental experts view as potentially very significant and negative on fisheries in the Mekong Basin, the way that the Chinese company engaged on this issue is a significant improvement from the way that many of the other hydropower investors from China have done in the past. Overall as well, you can see that there's been a slew of guidance coming out from the Chinese government, from MOFCOM, from the Ministry of Environment, which I believe has Environmental Protection, which I believe has changed names recently, and from SESAC on how Chinese state-owned enterprises should engage in investments abroad. So there is recognition, both internally among companies as well as among Chinese government stakeholders, that there's a perception problem here, that there is actual impacts on local communities that are not being addressed under the current methods of behavior, and there is interest in changing them. The challenge will be ensuring that there is some sort of monitoring process in place for the governments to work with the state-owned enterprises, and also for the state-owned enterprises themselves, which often defer management of these projects to local offices in Southeast Asia, and again, do them in coordination with the local government, where sometimes there's a disagreement on what needs to be done to ensure that this project is moved forward in a sustainable way. So that's a brief overview. I'm going to turn over to Yun.
Thank you, Courtney, for that comprehensive overview. I particularly like the fact that you do know the cases, you do know the projects and what happened to the politics behind the project. So now we're open for Q&A. As the chair, I'm going to use the privilege to ask the first question. And this is a blanket question for all the speakers here. So how would you assess, in the countries that you work on, or the countries that you're from, or have done research on, how would you assess how the Chinese money impacts the local politics? For example, there are speculations or observations about the Chinese money, for example, strengthening the position of certain politicians, of certain political groups, China favoring pro-China candidate, which in the argument indirectly consists implicit interference in the election or in the domestic politics. Is that true, or China is simply passively being influenced or affected by the result of the politics in each country? Does China take the initiative to shape them with Chinese money? So especially, I guess, in Thailand or Philippines, these countries are interesting cases. Kavi, please.
Well, it's a good question. I think in the case of Thailand, it's not a very good example, because if you have any political party that had links to the Chinese, say Chinese back, I think that will be doomsday for that party. So you don't have that kind of specificities, just like in Malaysian politics. You have Chinese MCA and all this. We don't have that kind of a political party. So as far as the Chinese influence in local politics, I think it's at the beginning. We have not seen the kind of political influence that manifested by American influence in the past 5 decades. So it's a little bit different. I think China's influence in political system in Southeast Asia is more prominently expressed in Malaysia. Thailand, not yet. I think in case like Sri Lanka, yes. But in the future, I'm not sure, because several projects now is pending. China fears that if you have a new government, just like in Malaysia, a lot of projects will be reviewed, making adjustment, or even cancel. But so far, Thailand has not yet reached that kind of a decision yet. As you can see, Thailand is very careful when they consider whatever project from China. The fact that you mentioned very well that the role of civil society in Thailand is very strong. So strong that any Chinese proposal must be screened over and over and over and over and over again, so much so that, you know, it create that kind of taboo. And you have outlined a specific example in the case of Cambodia. Now there's a lot of small cases in Thailand that related to future developments of Lan Chang Mae Kong. Also, China is now sending officials to talk to grassroots organization, something which China has never done before. So this kind of thing show that China is very pragmatic and very fast at learning, particularly on key issue. Specifically for me, I think Lanchang Mekong Corporation is a model that China wants to do good, want to give a very good impression that they have good rule of laws, very good environment consideration, take into considerations all the NGO things. For your question, I think it will take some time because Chinese influence in Thailand is through personalities, not yet into the kind of you see in Malaysia have politics, the whole UMNO backing and all that. Even, for example, in Thailand, you look at the Chinese influence or Chinese language is very minimum. In Malaysia, Chinese language is very influential. In Thailand, Chinese language newspaper is just advertising cheats. No, nothing, no news, nothing. It's just baloney, the whole 6 newspaper. So there's no political position on all that. So, and actually it's good for China to keep Thailand that way. So if you step up the influence like Malaysia, for example, in the past 2 years, you have seen news report that Chinese diplomat was very out in front, you know, try to pressure local governments, dealing expressions of demonstration, whatever, against the Chinese or not. But in Thailand, China will be extremely careful. So it's really, really careful, and it's actually taboo. So I think China relations with Thailand is very neutral in the sense. And I was very surprised that in the past 4 years, in America, mostly think tank thought that Thailand adopted pro-China policy. I think it was completely wrong. Thailand never pro anyone. We pro Thailand. We never pro China. We never pro America, because in the absence of America, we pro China. Of course, we pro Japan. But now with Trump coming back, nobody said they're starting, oh, you're pro America. So we are in good direction. So we are friends to all. So that's very interesting. I think you can wage against, for example, I said earlier, engagement China with Cambodia, with all these weak countries that have lower capacity, and then you have a high capacity country which refer to higher legal standard. It depends on your persistence. China will respond. For example, in the case of Thailand, it's a very good case study. Thailand is very persistent that when you want to deal with this high speed, we want our term, not your term. If we can meet halfway, fine. So it takes 3.5 years. So this is a very good case study. But in the case of Laos, I think Laos did not get some of the one, but not all. So it depends on how you position yourself.
Okay, so basically 2 conclusions. First of all, Chinese influence can be counterproductive. It may go the other way. The second one is the recipient countries should be persistent about their positions, and the Chinese will compromise.
Well, if it's worth, for example, in the case of Thailand, yes, it's worth. But in the case of many projects, for example, Mission Dam, after all this year, the overall geopolitics benefit speak louder, and China's have to change and then make all kinds of remedy measure, even set up 2 NGO to respond to the local complaint.
Yeah. Okay, Alvin?
Okay, that's a great question. It's also really hard to answer.
That's why I asked.
So the question of like, is China directly responding or to local, to local politics, or is local politics like shaping China? Of course, it's both, right? There's a tug of war there.
Sure.
In the Philippine case, I can speak of the Philippine and Indonesia much more, but I'll focus on the Philippines. But in the Philippine case, there were a lot of rumors that Duterte was, of course, like funded by China. In fact, there were even other rumors that his backers online, sort of like his troll army, is also funded by Chinese money. One time I tried to like get into it by but it was really hard to like get like documents from particular banks. But
No.
I also would end up in a media expose, which I really don't want to. So if that happened, a lot of parties would be involved. But I guess my answer to your question is like there's a direct influence, sort of like money that the Chinese government can directly sort of control, and sort of by the particular institutions, MOFCOM and all this, CDB, something that Courtney talks about much more. But there's also smaller Chinese investments that I've actually seen in the Philippines that actually had an upward rise when Rodrigo Duterte came into power. So particularly small restaurants in Makati City, or the resorts, for example, in the Palawan area and all these other things. A lot of them are not tied to this big SOEs, or not tied to big Chinese institutions. There were smaller companies who are out there to make money and take advantage of the upward rise of tourism. Similar to in Malaysia, although it's not really a small company, a lot of Chinese companies go and build real estate, for example, for Malaysian for Chinese overseas people from the PRC to go there and live and enjoy Malaysia. So there's some direct influence, which I think is something that it's hard to sort of get to. But I do think it's a tug of war, and I do think I also think that as everybody would know, China is not the only one doing this. I would argue that
Sure.
other countries as well are heavily involved. But the other thing is that the smaller ones as well, sort of the changing relations, also create a upward rise of Chinese investments, the smaller companies. And these smaller companies, to a certain degree, also can change the perception of, let's say, Filipinos and, for example, the Southeast Asian population. So just to end this answer, in the 2016 elections, there was a big debate about amongst the presidential election, what's your response to the South China Sea issue? And then a lot of them were oh, we're gonna support the decision. Even Duterte was I'm going to jet ski to the islands and plant the Filipino flag there. But at the same time, he was also vacillating, where we might end up in a talk, and we'll it's hard to I get, and sort of the Filipino perception is not static. It's subject to constant contestation by both pro-American forces and pro-Chinese forces. And this is where I would argue that it would be interesting to do a survey, which I will plan to do in my fieldwork, of Philippine perception on Chinese investments, and how it's changed, not just based on the South China Sea, but on the potential impact of Chinese investments. And changing perception of the Philippine population would then affect, I would argue, how elites maneuver, for example, Chinese FDI in the future.
It's a great answer. And Courtney?
So I will not really comment on the direct influence on elections. But I'll just make sort of 2 points. The first is that when China engages in investments in local countries, it develops very strong relationships with individuals inside the government and inside certain elite sectors. So naturally, there is an interest in ensuring that those individuals remain in power. I don't think that I'm not going to comment on the direct election, particularly because many of the countries in which I'm looking at Chinese investments don't necessarily have free and fair elections. So a potentially more interesting comment here is to look at the political transition that happened in Laos in 2016, where there was the changing of the guard internally. And there is a widespread perception that one of the former bright lights, who had brought a significant amount of Chinese investments into the country and helped broker a lot of key deals, including the Chinese investments in the railway inside Laos, Somsoat Langsavad, was transitioned out of power. And there was a widespread perception among many analysts that I spoke to in the region that was because he had been too friendly to China. So even in Laos, which is often called here almost a vassal of China, it's strongly within the Chinese orbit, there's a perception that Laos is, not able to balance between China and outside countries as effectively because it is so indebted to China, because of China's strong role in its development economically. Even there were concerns inside the National Assembly and inside the elite establishment that led to a transition in leadership that would be a little bit more balanced. And so I think that just gets back to the concern and the point that Kavi raised, that China can be its own liability in some ways, that if there is a growing perception that China has gotten too many good deals and that the locals have not equitably received benefits from those deals, then that can cause elite conflict of the sort that Alvin was talking about. So Laos is just an interesting comment here.
Well said, well said. And the new leadership of Laos, of course, went ahead with even more Chinese projects. So a little ironic. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Michael, please.
I have a question really about how much does the
there's
how much does the domestic customs of politics and running companies and so on in China as compared to Western countries makes a difference? In other words, if you look at the way in which companies prosper in China, the connections they make with high level is very important. Another element, of course, is where membership of the party comes in. Also, within China, you don't really get consciousness paid to civil society complaints, although there are many, many. On the whole, the approach is to suppress them. And in that sense, when Chinese state-owned enterprises deal with the outside world, they're dealing with it with that background. And they're dealing with that also with the understanding of how politics works, which is, as you said, is special to China. Now, the rule of law doesn't exist just to make regulations and make life difficult. The rule of law exists to protect the weak. And as far as the Chinese approach, as you have all described, has nothing to do with the weak. It's cultivating the strong, or they perceive to be the strong. As far as democracy is concerned, they see that as really corrupt and opening opportunities for them to take over particular personalities. They can do it either through bribery, or they can do it through intimidation in all sorts of different ways, or combining both. But the Chinese leaders, as far as I can see, have very poor understanding of what democracy is and what the rule of law is, even in the most Western of Western countries. So in that sense, everything is for sale. Everything depends on personal contact. So doesn't this draw a contrast between the way in which Chinese FDI works and that of most other countries? And finally, I'd just like to add one more word. I think that in actuality, the significance of and the amount of Chinese investment in Southeast Asia is exaggerated in comparison to that of Japan, in comparison to that of America, in comparison to that of the EU. And I think that over here and in Southeast Asia, the effect of exaggerating China's economic impact is not good.
Okay. So the size of the Chinese FDI and how is the Chinese practice really different from others? Should we get another question in the interest of time? Cassie, you had a question.
I do have a question. Would you please comment on how China might leverage their economic presence and investments to influence the recipient countries' foreign policies and so on? So in particular, in the case of Philippines, the Hague Rule, the South China Sea dispute, but the President Duterte basically kind of softened his position with anticipation of a large influx of Chinese investment. And then in the case of Thailand, according to some news reports, some political dissidents disappeared in Thailand and then later emerged in China because reportedly these people just being sent back to China because of closer ties between China and Thailand. And in the case of, say, Cambodia, Prime Minister Hun Sen recently launched a crackdown on the civil society and opposition party. And then EU threatened to cut the aid, but then he made a trip to China, and the Chinese government asserted their continuous support to Cambodia. So Yeah, so would you just comment on, some kind of potential impact on the recipient countries? Thank you.
So that is a great question.
Yeah.
So with those two questions, should we get some wisdom? Kathy?
Well, it's a good question. I arrived in Washington in the past 2 weeks. I have heard Thailand involved in American politics, the so-called black sites. So good friends have a lot of things going on you don't disclose. So you ask me, I cannot answer because I don't have direct lines, So that's news report. Probably somebody will have confirmed it. I think it's happened. It's not the first time. It happened with other countries as well. So it just shows you that you have this kind of secret dealings all the time with United States, which is, I was very surprised because I follow United States foreign policy toward Thailand. And we keep asking the same question, deny, until I arrived in Washington. Every day Thailand, I was so happy, but Thailand name was used in a different way. So in the case of Thailand, as I said earlier, it has not yet reached that kind of level that will influence. It actually will be liability for China to do that. Because Thailand politics is different from Malaysia or the Philippines. Philippines is outrageous, the politics. They can change from black and white. In Thailand, you don't do that. You don't go like this zigzag. The Thai is like smooth sailings, just go on and on. So it's not muddled through. We are different politics.
Keep it gray. Keep it gray.
That's
and
right.
blurry.
So yeah, it's not that kind of Duterte and then Aquino zigzag, change. No, Thailand never do that.
I have some words on that, but we can talk about that later.
Please do share.
The questions would be more
Sure.
interesting. So I don't have, I have a really long answer to but I'm not going to go there, sort of the difference between FDI of like China and the West. Maybe Kavi and Courtney can like talk about that much more. But in terms of the size, I do think that, in absolute levels, it's definitely a lot lower, not just in Southeast Asia, but everywhere in the world. But if you look at the 1990s and if we look at the percentage of the rate of growth, it's actually the fastest. So the percentage of the rate of growth is a more interesting figure than absolute numbers, especially with where it's going. And the other thing, apart from the percentage, the steepness of the growth, there's also a question of like the sectors that it goes to, which I think like apart from Japan, China is also investing heavily in infrastructure. A lot of other countries have an issue with investing in like there are other procedures and it takes a longer time to invest in this like particular sectors, which a lot of other Southeast Asian states like need, and that's why China so those are the two differences. But thank you for the question. That's a great question regarding influence. I would argue, and in fact I remember this. I was talking to a journalist from Wall Street Journal. He asked me the same thing, and then my answer was like, I think influence goes both ways, in terms of like if China, China invests like a train project in the Philippines. Let's say they sunk in 500 million, and then suddenly they have an issue in the South China Sea, and then Duterte would say, oh no, I'm not going to do that. Is China going to war to invade the Philippines for 500 million in Mindanao? Probably not. They wouldn't like risk. They wouldn't, the cost, the cost of that would be too much in my view. For and I guess, sorry, just to summarize my point, is that influence goes both ways. And then the Philippines can also have leverage. Like getting money from an investor is not just a question of losing power. You can also gain power from it. At least that's my view in terms of holding these investments hostage to a certain degree.
Related to that, Alvin, if I can present you with a different counterfactual. Hypothetically, if China is not giving Duterte these economic deals with these packages, do you think that Duterte's policy on South China Sea would remain constant or the same?
So that's a tougher iteration of your question. I would argue I would argue he wouldn't. He would use the. I'm sorry.
He would be tougher.
He would be tougher. Yeah, sorry. He would be tougher. Sorry, that's what I meant. So he would be tougher, and then he would try to play. He would try to play the United States and Japan against China, and then try to get investments for other sectors that China is providing right now. So I get the wise thing about Duterte is he's actually playing them off against each other, as a lot of other commentators have said, which is something that unfortunately Aquino did not do, and his own secretary.
I disagree. I disagree. I think there's another factor is the Philippines government relation to ASEAN. how you use ASEAN. Aquino completely reject ASEAN and delink its position on South China Sea with ASEAN, thinking that ASEAN is useless. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes. And Duterte was clever enough to use ASEAN and as an over-bargaining power with China. That is why it came out this way, even though Aquino moved to the arbitration without consultation with ASEAN, completely ignore, and thinking that by ignoring ASEAN, you can rely on United States. But there's also only certain level that U.S. influence can help Philippines in international issue like this. That's my argument. I think ASEAN factor should be featured in.
Quick response if it's okay. Yeah, I completely agree actually. The broader point is like Aquino did not use other options, which I think is like, yeah.
Okay, now we have an agreement. Courtney, please.
I will not comment on the Philippines and South China Sea. So going back to Michael's question about the way that China's investors have behaved domestically in China and how that has impacted the behavior that they have abroad. I think it is undoubtedly true that the domestic focus on using guanxi, government reliability, and managing political risk inside China, I think that is very clearly the reason that Chinese companies have used the similar behavior in Southeast Asia. It's the way that they operated within the domestic context. When they were going out to these other countries, they built relationships in a similar manner to the way that they had built relationships at home. That's the way that they managed projects. I also think that is, in some cases, has burned them, and though there is an evolution that you can see amongst mainly the Chinese companies that have run into challenges abroad and gone through a learning process. And is it going to be a long learning process? Yes, I think it is going to be a long learning process. There continue to be projects that run into these similar controversies, although it's been more than 5 years since Miyotson. I think at the same time that there's a parallel that can be drawn to the way that American, Japanese, and other Western investors operated many decades ago. So when you look at the role of infrastructure investments and broader foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia, as you pointed out, if you look at over the longest period of time, the United States and Japan are undoubtedly some of the largest investors. It will vary probably country to country who is on top, but Japan has a significant role. It has had a significant role in the region for many decades. And so the perception of China as coming in and causing problems is due both to the speed at which Chinese investment has flowed in the last decade, and the very high visibility of many of these Chinese projects, and the very high missteps that have happened with specific projects that are very controversial and very high profile, as well as sort of the broader low-level challenges that Chinese companies run into with not the Miyotson Dam, but smaller scale projects with roads here and there. It contributes to a perception that is not necessarily earned of China as coming in and taking over, because there are still many other actors, and China is also not a monolith, which is something that often gets set aside in discussion here. People talk about China as though all Chinese actors are behaving the same way, when in reality, on the ground, different Chinese actors have very different interests and will behave very differently. So within the investment sector, a state-owned enterprise, a state-level state-owned enterprise, a provincial-level state-owned enterprise, and a private sector company will come in with different baseline assumptions on how they should be developing their projects. They'll come in with different behaviors, often at different levels of expertise abroad, and to some extent different levels of oversight in meeting standards, whether that's their internal standards or the local standards at the company of the governments in which they're investing in.
Sure.
I think just want to add to your points, because a bigger corporation has a better governance. But the problems now in Southeast Asia, most of them SME, middle size. So there's nobody control. And I think this is one of the biggest headache that cost China investment, that create all kinds of misperception. If you have, for example, Huawei, for example, which learn on a high level, of course there are a lot of shortcoming. That kind of company now is learning, just like earlier years when Japanese invest in Southeast Asia, was very strong anti-Japanese in the 70s. I was the student brought up anti-Japanese. I ended up speaking Japanese, so you have a lot of phenomena like that. And I think, as you said, China is on a high learning curve.
Well, we're right on time. With that, it concludes our discussion today. Thank you so much for the informative and insightful and lively discussion about what is really going on the ground. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights.
Good job.
Again, thank you for coming. Feel free to stay on to get acquainted with our speakers. Thank you for coming.
I don't mean to. Thank you. Good job.
No.